This video is sponsored by Tabletop Ready Miniatures. Get your favorite minis at a discounted price by visiting tabletopreadyminiatures.com. Link in the description below. Hey Wargamers, today we're going to continue our 2019 update series of the Tau Codex by looking at the Cadre Fireblade. Now, the Fireblade is pretty much the go-to HQ choice in my opinion for almost every Tau army out there. It's a universally valuable tool in your arsenal, and even though there aren't a huge diversity of HQ choices for us, the Fireblade really stands out as a valuable asset to most Tau armies, and is basically the go-to Warlord in my opinion. So we're going to talk about the Cadre Fireblade's strengths and weaknesses today, as well as how you might want to use it in your army. Alright, so let's jump into it by starting off with the profile. Alright, so for 42 points, you get a single Cadre Fireblade. He has movement 6, weapon skill 3 up, ballistic skill 2 up. That's really important. Strength 3, toughness 3, 5 wounds, 3 attacks, leadership 8, and a 4-up save. He comes with a pulse rifle and a marker light, and then has For the Greater Good, as most Tau do, and then volley fire, which is really his signature ability, and we'll get into that in a moment. Now, a few things I want to point out about his profile here is, one, he actually has a fair amount of durability. With 5 wounds and a 4-up save, that's really not bad. And he has a 2-up ballistic skill. The only other unit that you really get with a 2-up ballistic skill, aside from things like Long Strike and other special characters, are your commanders. So the Cadre Fireblade stands out in that regard alone. It's an infantry model with a 2-up ballistic skill. You can't get that anywhere else, guys. That's money right there. And he's a character. So having that 2-up ballistic skill combined with a marker light is fantastic. And that's really one of the selling points of the Cadre Fireblade, is that he is a 2-up marker light that you can get in your army, and that is the most reliable marker light that you can get in the Tau Codex. So really, that marker light is a huge asset to the army on its own, let alone any of the other things that we're talking about today. Now, I mentioned he has For the Greater Good. This is pretty inconsequential to how the Fireblade functions. He's one guy, he has one pulse rifle. For the Greater Good on a single pulse rifle, really not going to make a difference in the outcome of a charge in an Overwatch situation. It's a snowball's chance in hell of making, a wound or anything at all. So really not something that is even worth the time I'm spending talking about it right now. What is worth the time to talk about, though, is his other special rule, volley fire. What volley fire does is allows models within units within 6 inches of the Fireblade to add an extra shot when firing pulse carbines, pulse rifles, or pulse pistols at half range. So in the kind of de facto scenario, you have a pulse rifle, which is range 30, firing at 15 inches or closer, fires 3 shots, not 2. This is, a huge force multiplier. You're adding an additional 50% output for every fire warrior on there. So you're gaining, 50% value on all these fire warriors that you're, surrounding the Cadre Fireblade with. And that has tremendous value in any type of gunline situation. There's a few things that we need to talk about with that, though. One is that this implies that you really do want to have most, if not all, of your fire warriors in your army around a Cadre Fireblade. That means that you're going to have kind of this, death bubble of infantry surrounding a Cadre Fireblade, where you have your, central Cadre Fireblade, and then you have rays of fire warriors coming out from them. Because again, the unit has to be within 6 inches. The model does not. So you can have, conga lines of fire warriors stretching out from your single Cadre Fireblade, and still get the benefit. And that's really the way that you maximize the benefit of the Cadre Fireblade, is by, stringing models out from that central point. And that makes things challenging if you're trying to move your fire warriors around a lot to grab different objectives and things like that. They're all, pulling in different directions. It's not challenging, though, if you're playing a gunline army. And this is why Cadre Fireblades are a really good component of, pretty much any army, but especially gunline armies, is that they are able to be an anchor for that infantry gunline. Notably, also, volley fire doesn't apply to things like pulse blasters or burst cannons, other types of pulse weaponry. It only applies to carbines, rifles, and pistols. And of those three, you're really getting the most value out of pulse rifles because they have the longest range. At range 30, that means you're getting 3 shots at 15 inches, as opposed to 9 inches with a carbine, or, basically standing next to a model with a pistol. So really, we're not getting much value out of the volley fire rule or the Cadre Fireblade if we are surrounding him with carbines or pistols. Really, those pulse rifles are where it's at. And you can amplify the benefit that you get from pulse rifles using things like pulse accelerator drones and firing with the Borcan Septenet. So either of those two things are going to extend the range that you get those 3 shots out of a pulse rifle up to 21 inches if you take both Borcan and a pulse accelerator drone, which is huge. That's a huge range that you're actually able to cover with 3 shots. Consider this. A unit of 10 fire warriors in a strike team with pulse rifles at 21 inches doing 30 shots. That's quite the hefty volume of fire. And if you have a couple of those units, let's say 3, that's 90 shots, right? I mean, simple arithmetic there, but nonetheless, 90 pulse shots are going to take care of a lot of different types of unit types just by the volume of fire. You're going to roll 6s, you're going to have them roll 1s. It's a mathematical likelihood that 90 pulse shots are going to do some damage to something. So there's a lot of utility in that. And this is why we want to surround the Cadre Fireblade with strike teams with pulse rifles and not strike teams with carbines, pathfinders with carbines, drones with carbines, is because the pulse rifle is just much more easily implemented than anything with a carbine, right? We don't have to move to get closer. We have this extended range and we can do a lot of damage. We don't have to be 9 inches away, which is actually fairly challenging to do with infantry like a strike team or even with drones. So having that flexibility that's allowed by taking pulse rifles with strike teams surrounded by a Fireblade is really valuable. Cadre Fireblades are good in any SEP because of the aforementioned reasons, but there are a few SEPs that they do particularly well with, they lean into, kind of facilitate some synergy. The first of which is going to be Tau Sept. We've talked about Tau Sept a lot. It's a really powerful Sept, and having the ability to fire an additional shot in Overwatch, makes their Septenet even better. So more volume of fire means more chances to successfully land a hit in Overwatch, and volley fire plays into that very well. Another great Sept for Cadre Fireblades, of course, is Borcan, because it adds that extra 6 inches to rapid fire weapons, which means you have an additional 3 inches on your half range threshold. So again, from 15 inches to 18 inches on a pulse rifle gets you 3 shots now. Also, Farsight Enclaves, kind of similar to the reason why Cadre Fireblades are good for Tau Sept. Farsight Enclaves benefits from Cadre Fireblades because it just gives you more volume of fire. If you're close enough to benefit from the Farsight Enclave Septenet, then you are also going to be benefiting from the volley fire buffs of a Cadre Fireblade. So that works out fairly well as well. Lastly, Vior La is kind of but still good. But it's because essentially the benefit of volley fire undoes the cost of using the Vior La Septenet, which allows you to advance and still fire rapid fire weapons, but they become assault. So instead of being rapid fire 1, they become assault 1, which means that you lose your shot at half range. But if you're at half range with volley fire, you get 2 again. So it actually, works out fairly well. Again, it's challenging because you want to move your units around a lot with Vior La. You don't have that kind of tight gun line as much with Vior La, and so it can be difficult to have as many fire warrior units benefit from volley fire, but you can do it. And this kind of alleviates the cost of advancing and using that tenet, which is nice. Lastly, I want to talk about Cadre Fireblades being your Warlord. Now, I think Cadre Fireblades are probably the best Warlord in the Codex. Not saying that they're going to be your only HQ choice. There are, basically de facto choices like Shadow Sun that are going to be in most lists, but most lists should also have a Cadre Fireblade, and when a Cadre Fireblade is present, I think it makes a lot of sense for it to be your Warlord for a few reasons. One, it's a character, of course, it has to be, but it's an infantry character with a small number of wounds and a respectable stat line. So it's easily hid, it's not a huge model, you can hide it amongst a unit of infantry in a building, whatever, very easily hid, which means that it's going to stay on the table longer than something that's, obvious and easy to target, which is good. That means that you get more utility out of your Warlord trait. Secondly, it has more durability than the obvious, kind of counter example, which would be an Ethereal. Ethereal has a lot of the same attributes in terms of size and characteristics, but it has a worse armor save and fewer wounds compared to a Cadre Fireblade. So, in the event that a Cadre Fireblade does get, punched in the face or shot, having the Cadre Fireblade have that durability is valuable. Finally, the Cadre Fireblade is going to be surrounded by his bros the whole game. That's his point, right? We want him to be surrounded by bros so that they benefit from volley fire. So he has kind of built-in screening, whereas things like Crisis Commanders are much more of a bruiser type of Warlord. So they're in a higher risk situation. They have to get close to use their weapons, and they are more likely to die, especially in the case of a Cold Star. Cold Stars, they're going to run up the board at some point during the game and put themselves in the line of fire. And that's a calculated risk you have to make, but it's a risk that you can totally avoid by making the Cadre Fireblade your Warlord. So that's something that I think is really valuable there, is that we have a Warlord that gives us a lot of utility and is easily hid, and not something that is going to be in a high-risk situation. So the Cadre Fireblade, I think, really makes a tremendous Warlord for any Tau army. Yes, it feels a little weird. You have this really cool commander, awesome model, and then you have your Cadre Fireblade. Seems a little bit not as cool. But I think strategically it makes a lot of sense for the Cadre Fireblade to be the Warlord, and that is why I almost universally recommend that Cadre Fireblades be the Warlord compared to either Ethereals or Commanders. As far as which Warlord trait to take on your Cadre Fireblade, I think the clear winner is Through Unity Devastation. If you've been watching my list review series, you know that I recommend this widely, and that's because it really plays into what the Fireblade does. So Through Unity Devastation allows you to improve the AP characteristic of wounds that are made on a 6+ for units within 6 inches of your Warlord. And so if you pair that with volley fire, not only are we getting a large number of shots, we're getting an even larger number of shots because of volley fire. So we're getting a ton of shots that have a pretty good chance of getting at least a few procs out of your Warlord trait, which is good. But aside from that, it also applies to any unit that's within 6 inches. It's not just for pulse rifles or pulse carbines or pulse pistols. It applies to your Riptide and your Broadside and whatever else that you have hanging out. So really, this is an essential gunline Warlord trait. And as we've talked about, Cadre Fireblades really play into that gunline strategy. So Through Unity Devastation is a fantastic trait. It is going to proc a lot more the more volume of fire you have, which the Cadre Fireblade facilitates, but it's going to work with your army in general too. So a really strong Warlord trait. A distant second is going to be Academy Luminary, which is the Vior Law Warlord trait. Basically extends his volley fire bubble by a few inches. And, that's good because we like volley fire and more volley fire is good, but it's not, it's not something that is essential for your army to function. You can get, the same coverage out of 6 inches as you can with 9 inches just by strategic placing most of the time. So, like I said, a very distant second, in my opinion. Through Unity Devastation is a fantastic Warlord trait for any gunline army, but especially for a Tau gunline army led by a Cadre Fireblade. It just makes sense. I think it's a great Warlord trait. As far as signature systems are concerned, there's not a huge selection for Cadre Fireblades. A lot of the more interesting things are for Crisis Commanders only, but kind of the go-to is going to be Pure-Tide Engram Neurochip. It's going to be useful on the chance that he misses or somebody nearby him misses. Plus, it allows you to recoup command points, which is good. I think there's an argument to be made to not put your Pure Tight Engram neurochip on your Warlord, put it on a different character like a Firesight Marksman, because then you're mitigating the chances of suffering a loss of both your Warlord and the Pure Tight Engram neurochip, right? If we have, all of our eggs in separate baskets, we're not going to lose all of our eggs as quickly, basically. So I think that's a good recommendation, but not necessarily, a universal recommendation. If you don't have a Firesight Marksman or something like that, put it on your Cadre Fireblade. It's fine, but he doesn't really need it. Someone else can take it. It's probably actually going to be better on a Firesight Marksman that is more likely to miss. So, yeah. If you're going to take a signature system, though, Pure Tight Engram neurochip, that's the way to go. All right, so long story short, how do I recommend that you take your Cadre Fireblade? Well, I would recommend 1 to 2 per army, depending on the number of detachments you have and things like that. But 1 to 2 is generally pretty good. If you are getting more than 2, look at options like Darkstrider, look at bringing in Ethereals, other types of HQ units. Really 1 to 2 is going to be sufficient not only to give you a good marker light base, but also to buff your pulse rifles. You generally don't need more than 2 to get good coverage on your fire warriors with volley fire. So, in addition to getting those HQ units, you might also want to look at bringing in more Firesight Marksmen because they're cheaper and they give you a comparable level of precision with their marker light. It's not quite as good. It's a 3-up ballistic skill. But, once I get 2 Cadre Fireblades in my army, I'm looking at pumping up my marker light numbers with Firesight Marksmen instead. So, overall, fantastic unit. You should take it. Right? It's a fantastic unit, great Warlord. It is a critical component to the functioning of a Tau army. And that's saying a lot for a model that when it came out felt pretty underwhelming. This is a model that when it first came out, I was really skeptical of, and in 8th edition has just, become an all-star. So, overall, great unit. Thanks for watching. Let me know what you think in the comments below. And of course, happy wargaming. Hey everyone, thanks for watching. This channel is made possible by my supporters over on Patreon. If you enjoyed this video, consider joining our community over there and the associated Discord channel. Special thanks to Aaron Fox, Shifty, Jim Bob, Scott Heater, Nick Steele, Jared Egler, Tao Oswell, Zach Brooks, Stephen Cohen, Jake Johnson, Eric Jackson, Zealous Brimstone, Evan Wells, Benjamin, Julian Peck, Giovanni DiMaggio, and Chris Kessler.